Hello, and welcome to the Media Copilot. It's a podcast and newsletter all about how generative AI is changing the media, journalism, and the news. I'm Pete Pachal, longtime tech journalist and founder of the Media Copilot. And on this podcast, I'm excited to bring you fascinating conversations with fellow journalists, media executives, and the people helping to build the AI-driven newsrooms of the future. I'm excited today to welcome to the Media Copilot podcast, Joe Amditis. Joe is the Associate Director of Operations at the Center for Cooperative Media at Montclair State University in New Jersey. In his role, he researches how newsrooms can use generative AI tools and has written extensively on the subject, most notably how newsrooms can create their own custom GPTs, which are, of course, those AI-powered apps built on OpenAI's technology. I'm excited to talk to him today about the application of AI in newsrooms, the tools that exist today, and even better, how journalists can leverage them. Joe, welcome to the Media Copilot.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Cool. So I'm excited to talk to you about some of the more pragmatic aspects of using AI in journalism. But before we do that, I'd really love it if we could just sort of take a step back. And I'd love to get your perspective on sort of some broader thoughts of AI with respect to journalism. And one of the things I always sort of wonder about, and people ask me, is, what is really the mindset that journalists should have, even before they even do anything with AI? Like, how should they be regarding it, do you think?
I think they should be regarding it with a sense of calm and measured response. I think, journalism is not the only industry that does this, but especially in any struggling industry where there's a lot of precarity and uncertainty, there's a tendency to jump at the shiny new toy, and whether that's instant articles and AMP articles from Google, right, or video, or data collection and personalized programmatic stuff. This cycle sort of repeats. And while personally I do think that there is a noticeable and obvious difference, or maybe not difference, but there is certainly something that makes you go, oh man, this is wild. And it's part of it's what I felt when I first started using some of these tools, and it's what a lot of people have felt. But after that initial shock wears off, I think the glint in some folks' eyes, particularly management in larger news organizations, who may not have direct relationships with these tools and understand how they've evolved and grown over the years, they obviously, it eventually comes back to, how can I use this to make more money, and either by paying people less, or firing people or whatever, or by cutting corners and just sort of adding to the what Cory Doctorow calls the enshittification process there. And so I think you should approach these tools with curiosity, with skepticism, not necessarily for the tools or the technology themselves, but certainly for the people in the organizations and companies who make and sell them. And also with a sense of history and longevity. So understanding that these tools are always changing, these technologies are always changing, but also the way that we relate to technology is a little bit slower on that change. And so try to think of what these tools will look like and what the industries that they impact will look like once they're not the coolest thing anymore, once they're a little more boring and faded into the background. And I would argue, and I have argued, that is really when you're going to start to see the real world implications of these tools, when they really start to grow and flourish. It's when they become boring, or when they fade into the background processes of the other tools and apps that we've used. And some of those evolutions are happening quicker than others. Some of them are not so much. But just, a little temperance, but also, measured curiosity, I would say.
Definitely want to get into the tools, but I wanted to sort of zero in on one of the things you mentioned, because it's like I totally agree to sort of, particularly after the shock wears off, approaching this with some skepticism. And journalists are naturally skeptical. But what I also find is that if you want to use these tools in some way, or at least want to figure out where to use them, you have to mix that skepticism with a bit of I guess, for lack of a better term, wanting it to work. And you can sort of see too much into that and sort of see where the bad places certain companies have gone with having full articles written by this. But I think what the temptation that we see with a lot of skepticism about that application is they point at these bad articles that have been written and everyone goes, oh, this doesn't work at all. And what's
I
the
see that a lot.
balance? You know what I mean? Like, how do you have that healthy skepticism that gets you away from those bad use cases, but still have kind of a can we make this work attitude toward it?
Sure. I mean, for number one, I see that all the time. That's one of my, one of the most annoying and frustrating things to see. And the partner to that is like the breathless NPR interview with somebody, with the anchor or the host who's never used it before, and it is like, I asked it, to look up this thing for me, and it got it wrong. Is this the new face of misinformation? And obviously, it's not to dismiss the implications when it comes to the ability to generate nonsense at scale, but the idea that, like, is that really what you want to use these things for? People don't really generally know that these tools, the big get for these tools originally, whether it's back in GPT-4 or GPT-2, was text classification, the ability to look at large bodies of text and classify them. And that would have been a huge benefit to researchers, data analysts, and things like that, and journalists as well. I mean, anybody who's ever had to clean a spreadsheet knows that it's a pain in the ass and it takes forever. And even having a little 12, 15, 20% boost or help on that to speed some of the things up and move your work and your focus onto more substantive matters, or just verifying and making sure that the labels are there instead of having to type them all out. Even that modest productivity increase would have been a big get for these kind of tools. And so my advice for that is to, number one, the beauty of these tools is that there is virtually, in fact, I'd say literally zero cost for experimentation. You can take some of these free tools, you can, play with the APIs, play around with something absurd and not related to your work. Try to, one of the first things I did with it was I had an argument with it about a book that had just came out, spoilers for a book series, the latest one's released, to see if it knew things, and then I had it serve as a dungeon master for a one-person D&D match, game or whatever. So just try to break them, try to push the limits, see what they're good at, try to fool it, trick it. And that'll really give you sort of the contours of what these tools are capable of. And then, like, anytime you're trying to learn a new skill or a new app or tool, it's best to have a task at hand. It's very difficult for me. My whole life, I just really wanted to learn Illustrator. It scares me. It's scarier than Photoshop to me. But no matter what, I can't just sit down and go, let me just figure out Illustrator. You got to have a task or a tutorial or a lesson set, and when you have that task that you're trying to do, it becomes much more clear some of the ways that these tools can and cannot help in those various tasks and goals. So that would be my advice. Mess around with it, try to break them, try to trick them. And then once you're comfortable in understanding how the interactions and relationship goes, then, find something that you might want to try it out on. Again, low stakes, start very low stakes. Don't give any information to these things that you wouldn't give to a for-profit data broker or, big data company. And certainly just mess around, because there's this sense that I get from a lot of people, and this is a hangover from, the earlier tech explosions, where I don't know how to describe it other than it seems like a lot of people are afraid that if they press the wrong key on their keyboard, they're going to delete their entire computer. And a lot of times when new technology comes out, there's this hesitance, like, if I flip the wrong switch, the whole thing is going to explode. And it's just, this is not the case. And whether it's trying to learn how to write simple HTML or whatever, or if it's trying to interact with these new and emerging tools and bots, there really is no downside to messing around. It may turn out that you don't like them. It's not for you. It's just, I prefer to do it my old way, and I'm getting by just fine. And that's cool. I don't know how well that'll serve you, 10 years down the line when the interface has now changed so much to incorporate this technology that you're lost. I would argue that even if you don't end up using it, you should understand how to use it so you know how other people can use and abuse it and know how to spot that when it happens. But there's no rule that says you have to now use AI for everything or use these bots for everything, when it makes more sense in some cases to just type it yourself.
That's very good guidance. I think certainly you're a person who has spent a lot of time messing around, as you say, and finding the edges of these things. You probably have a good sense, more than most, of what these tools are good at, what they're not good at. What do you think, if you had to pick, say, your top three first principles, so to speak, when using AI in work, what would those be? Sort of trying to take from the messing around some general rules of thumb that journalists can apply when applying this to their work.
Number one is it's very tough to Well, number one, I would say, let me back up. Number one is there's a difference between the interface, the apps, like the web app and everything, and the mobile app interface, and the API usage. So if you need consistency, you go with API usage. You do these, API requests and responses. It is a much more stripped down version of the model with a lot more customization. So, and if you're already lost, at that point, that's fine. And that's where the sort of the GPTs come in handy, because that's a sort of in-house API. It's almost an API call to itself in a lot of ways, because you're allowed to customize that, and you're asking the model to do things with a certain layer of instructions on top of it. So understand the difference between the public-facing, like commercial interfaces, and the more developer-side API stuff. And if you need something that is consistent every time, that you don't have to constantly go back and check and update your instructions, go with API. And if you're looking for something a little more creative, or as a sort of like assistant, like a partner kind of a thing, a little like a sidebar friend, use the chat interface one. The next thing would be don't get complacent, because it is very tough. It's very, very easy to get used to these kind of tools and these workflows, and lose yourself a little bit in them, because you're offloading a lot of stuff that is annoying, but maybe necessary in some cases. I mean, the obvious example is I very quickly abandoned all hope of it writing anything for me, not only because the content that it put out was kind of trash and repetitive, and it's a better writer than most average writers. But if you have spent any time in your life honing your writing skills, you're likely better than it is, technically speaking, like structurally speaking, you're likely already better at writing in that sense. And also, it's so much work, and it's so inconsistent to try to get it to learn your particular style, that it's not worth it. And then the third thing is, like, writing is thinking, as they say. And if you and the amount of time in some tasks that it takes to write something is where the value is. I think Ethan Malik brought the example up of letters of recommendation for students. My students, I teach at Montclair, and my students have asked for letters of recommendation. And if that letter of recommendation now does not come along with the time that it took me to take out of my day and my schedule to write it and sit down and say, this student is so good, I'm willing to burn some time, of which I have a finite amount, to say this person deserves a job or this position, then what does it mean when that no longer requires that commitment or that sacrifice? And I'm simply just shelling out those things. So try to understand and find a balance between what these tools are good for, what their best use cases, and when it is important to not use them.
Yeah, that's a good perspective on the sort of time it takes being valuable. And I always think about this in sort of with respect to another idea of certain skills just atrophying if we stop using them, right? So it's like, I think most writers have dealt with the task of having to rewrite a press release, for example.
Oh, God,
and that's, good entry-level thing for interns and junior people, but it is like, okay, so if we offload a task like that to AI, now no one's doing that or even building that skill. And, one, I already worry a little bit what the interns do, but more broadly, I'm more like, well, then if this muscle that was previously a human muscle that we were working, as tedious it was to work, is no longer being worked, what does that mean to skill building as a whole?
Sure.
It's a little philosophical with it, but it's a thing I think about.
Yeah, and that kind of thinking can be applied to, we don't have the interns cut the film in the darkroom anymore. Now they're just, loading it into Photoshop or Lightroom. It's not. I think what will happen is, obviously the skill sets required will evolve. So maybe the interns or the early career entry level employees will be responsible for crafting the prompts and monitoring the prompts and instructions, and reviewing the outputs and making sure they're consistent. I mean, it may get more and more meta or abstract in some ways, but it also may be. And again, this is all assuming that you would want these things to write things for you. I also assuming that you want to continue the practice of rewriting press releases. That it's a bad thing that goes away. I'm not saying that either way, but I think what is more likely to happen is once the dust settles a little bit more, and it'll shuffle up every once in a while here and there, but ultimately once the majority of the dust settles, the new skill sets and demands will emerge, and whether or not those are more or less time consuming, or more or less vital or central to the process, will be determined by the organization and the needs of the community it serves. But ultimately, I think we'll still have roles for people who are still learning. We'll still have skills that everyone needs to learn when they're entering an industry. That just might involve some form of prompt supervision or bot accompaniment in that way as well, instead of sitting down to rewrite. The example I always think of too is when I was working for a law firm in Harlem, right at the end of my college undergraduate degree, and as like a work study thing, and the partner in the firm who was my professor at Rutgers had me going through these UN dispute resolution tribunal case files to find mentions of things, and I didn't realize this, but he had no idea that Command F or Control F was a thing. He didn't know that I could just search a document. I can OCR it and I can search a document. So I was like, here's 87 references to this case, blah, 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 in like 15 minutes. And he was like blown away, like how it takes me that long to get the copies of the paper. And I'm like, you're printing these? I'm just putting them into Adobe and I'm OCRing them. Now, at the same time, these are photocopies of texts and OCR isn't perfect. So there still is a need to review that and make sure that they didn't get missed. But I'm not printing this out and thumbing through 600-page documents anymore. I'm starting with a broad, search and find and whatever on digital. So in the same way, the productivity and the efficiency of the tools are evolving, but they're still not perfect as any other tool is not perfect. So you all of this still requires and always should require robust human oversight to make sure that you can stand by and stand behind anything your organization publishes or puts out. It doesn't matter if you got it from a bot or a freelancer, you still have the obligation, and the onus is on you and your organization to vet, verify, and approve, and then stand by whatever you put out, regardless of the source or the process that it went through.
You're inspiring me to launch a Command F business now for perhaps smaller law firms.
It's so much worse than that too. It's law firms, local governments. I mean, it's universities. It's bad out there. So this is another reason why a lot of people are the hype people around like, hey, it's going to take over. It's like we have been trying to get our families and coworkers to use Zoom for 4 years now.
Right.
And I still have to tell people how to unmute or change their audio input. I don't think we're quite there yet.
There's definitely, when you get into AI, there's a lot of, meanwhile in the real world that you sort of have to think about. So we've talked about use cases a little bit here, right? We've talked about the rewriting of the press release. You said using AI for any kind of writing is probably a bad idea, at least in terms of the article writing that is traditionally associated with media. So let me ask you directly then, what do you think are the use cases that are really well suited for AI in a newsroom these days? And let's just go over them.
Well, number one, documentation. Documentation. Even the simple thing, and one of the examples I think I put in one of the guides is a little journal bot. Oh my God, the ability to combine, everything is AI now. Like, it's so annoying. Like Otter, for instance. The Otter is the transcription service. I mean, the URL is literally otter.ai. And this is before ChatGPT was announced. But transcription and audio processing using machine learning, we call it AI now, using machine learning has drastically improved to the point where you don't have to hop on Drag and Dictate anymore and listen to the audio in one headphone and then speak it, into the microphone to make sure that the auto-generated transcripts are not perfect again, but they're miles beyond what they used to be. And you combine the ability to really capture, like 85, 90% accuracy capture of audio, spoken audio, and then to transcribe that. And then you layer on top of that the ability of large language models to, sift through that. And you have yourself an amazing, really easy voice memo based, professional documentation or journal, process here. I have one set up with a structured prompt that just says, I will give you a journal note, and I want you to help me organize those thoughts, categorize them, tag them, and present them in a bulleted list with headings, right? And I'll tell you what, anybody who's ever had to do an annual performance self-evaluation, it's money. It's golden. I mean,
Nice.
throughout every day on the way home from work, I'm driving, I hit the chat GPT, audio button. And as I'm driving, I just talk about what I did that day. I don't have to be coherent. I don't have to worry about diction or punctuation. I just yap. At my phone for 5 minutes. And then it takes that, transcribes it, and then fits it and formats it into a professional work thing. And then Zapier or some automation throws that into a Google Sheet. End of the year comes around, end of the quarter, whatever comes around, I grab all the journal notes, I throw it back into chat, which now I use Claude for that because chat has let me down too many times. Throw it into Claude and say
Chat GPT.
Chat GPT.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes. Sorry.
Your own shorthand. Yeah,
we're on close personal terms now, so I can call it chat. But yeah, I throw it into a chatbot, let's just say, and give it instructions. Say, hey, this is what I want my performance review to look like. Here's the documentation from my journal entries. Do your thing. Yeah. That alone saves me, like bare minimum, saves me like 5 hours a year. Let's just say, right? 5 hours a year, not including the time it would have taken me to manually document and write down my thoughts. Meeting documentation, the note takers are everywhere. We've already seen the explosion of the now kind of annoying Zoom note taking bots, whether it's Autopilot, Fathom, Read, the Zoom IQ AI companion, all that nonsense. And there's a conversation about how annoying that is and how intrusive that feels. But if we're talking like a meeting that is on the record, that is supposed to be documented, how much more engaged I can be in the actual conversation, knowing that I'm going to have a transcript, I'm going to have summaries, I'm going to have action items pulled out, bullet points. It frees my brain up to actually listen instead of constantly worrying about listening and trying to remember at the same time. So that as a baseline, just those things alone is worth like a $15 a month, $20 a month thing, especially if you can share that amongst your team. And it really is a sort of scribe / stenographer or whatever role that that's one of the jobs that AI is absolutely already are taken over. And yeah, that's just how it is.
So what about in terms of a use case? I'll just throw out some use cases for you and let me know what you think of them.
Sure.
So one thing that I think AI is getting increasingly used for is sort of what I would call the Chrome around articles, which is to say everything that isn't the article, like social media copy, the headline, the sub-headlines, all these sort of bits of stuff that are meant to either improve the reading experience or promote the content in some other platform. What do you think? Is that a job that should be taken over by AI?
So I definitely use it in that way in some ways. One of the ways that I like to use it, I think it sucks at headlines. First of all, I can't get it to stop writing headlines in damn title case. I hate title case. I think it should be outlawed by the U.S. government.
I also find it does colons all the time. It does these two-part
It loves doing colons. Oh my God, it's like an academic. I've never met an academic who publishes a paper without a colon pre-title. That's really annoying. And so you have to once you add these things to like your custom instructions or the API prompt instructions you're giving it to it, it can get the title case is a separate case. I literally have been battling with this since these things came out. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. I have to ask Sam Altman if I ever get him in a room. I'm gonna string him up, stop making it right. But anyway, the one that I find most useful in that case is, again, I don't really like the social copy it posts. It sounds like every LinkedIn influencer I've ever seen, or these top 10 ways you're using this wrong thread. I hate those people. The dead-eye 1,000-yard entrepreneur stare kind of tweets is what I'm thinking of. But what it is good at, and especially if you're talking about work that you've written or that you're really engrossed in, is giving you a perspective or at least an overview of why people should care about this. It sometimes feels a little self-evident to people who are engrossed in this work and are doing this, or the people who are affected by the stories and the issues that you're covering. But sometimes it can help make a case for why someone should give a shit about this, and put it in a bulleted list. You give it the copy you wrote, so you're familiar with it, and you're not worried about it hallucinating as much because it's working from a corpus that is right in front of it, as opposed to trying to draw on its training base and model everything. And you're just saying, hey, read this, tell me why what the implications are, possibly implications. And that alone is like a nice sort of low intensity extra layer of perspective for contextualizing your work and honestly making the case for why people should not only care about it but support it and pay for it. So that can be really useful. I very rarely use verbatim what it generates. But if I do use any of it, it typically comes from that section that I've created, which is, make the case for why people should care about this. I'll grab snippets from there. Oh, that's a good angle. I didn't really consider that. So in that sense, it's pretty useful.
Hmm.
But it's
Cool.
still, documentation still takes the cake in terms of value add, I think.
What about sort of stuff pre-story even? So you're kind of like I guess there's a bunch of things it can do. So there's like obviously brainstorming story ideas. There's sort of gathering news, which is to say like sort of browsing the web or looking at its corpus and sort of, well, I wouldn't be looking at the corpus because that's beyond, but I'm thinking specifically, I don't know if you've seen Semaphore Signals and what they're doing with regard to news gathering, which is they're kind of going out on the internet, finding stories in multiple languages and having an AI summarize them for their reporters, which they then
Oh,
sort
to
of
like give them like little
string together.
dispatches so that they can, yeah. I
Yeah.
think it's a good concept. I think I like to talk about these tools using the metaphor of a metal detector. So you're on Asbury Park, you're metal detecting out there on the shore at the shore.
I've
The metal
heard
detector
people do
can, yeah, right, exactly. The metal detector will beep and let you know that there's something under the sand. Depending on how much you're willing to spend on a metal detector. I'm not in the community, but the metal detector doesn't know what it is. It doesn't know how it got
right.
there. It doesn't know what the significance, the cultural history of it. It just says, hey, there might be something in here that you might want to look at, and it's up to you to dig it up, to analyze it, to look at it, and understand what this value is, right? Either to yourself, to person who lost it, or to some antiques roadshow thing. And in that sense, it can be really useful. That scraping through town council transcripts, legal documents, translating legal documents into human language, which is
Right.
also useful. And really forcing you to grapple with the stuff that's in these documents as a sort of alert system in the way you described it, I think is a really good use case. And I've seen some folks trying to do this. It really, these tools are really hampered, or the value and the effectiveness of these tools are infinitely increased by the connection of them to like a spreadsheet, for instance, both from a trigger and response perspective. Like when there's a new row, do something with it, and then send me what you've done, right? You get user generated comments or submissions on something or tips. Give me a confidence score for how reliable this sounds or how likely this sounds. You're not going to tell me whether it's true or not. You're not going to fact check for me because that would be ridiculous, and there's no way I would ever trust it to be correct. You'd have to fact check. It's fact check, but give me a confidence score. Give me a percentage of how reasonable this sounds or how likely this sounds based on, let's say, a data dictionary or a set of criteria that you've given it in advance. And then you to look at the score ranges and the grouped ranges of those, and you say, okay, we got some 50 to 75% confidence scores. We got some 75 and up. We'll do a cursory pass at the 50% and below, but we'll focus on the ones that seem to be most promising at first. So even just that sense of like narrowing down those signals and trying to separate or at least estimate what might be noise and what might be a signal. Yeah, absolutely great use case. For something like that, though, it really is. That's something that like an organization with the staff to mess around and experiment like that would do.
Right.
For my experience, and the majority of my work is usually with folks who are 1, 2, 3 person organizations.
Right.
They're hyper local startups. They are small nonprofit newsrooms. They are civic information operations and stuff. And so when you have a team that can do kind of stuff like that, or if you were able to pay somebody to experiment with this stuff, yeah, that's really cool. But for now, if you have the time and the resources to play around with that, cool. But for the most part, it's just trying to find like maybe one entry point where these things can add maybe one or two layers of additional insight or input to your already existing workflow. That seems to be, in most cases that I've seen in both practice and in theory, where the biggest value is. And that also serves as a really great entry point in itself to understanding some of the other ways you might be able to layer these on top of what you already do.
Cool. Let's switch gears here for a minute and talk
Okay.
about generative images. So, generative images, when I think about them, I feel like they really epitomize the fear of job and economic loss even more than these sort of text generators, right? Because everything
Yeah.
you said about generating text and articles feels right. It's not very good at that. If you use it for that at all, you're not really getting much in terms of the efficiencies you would gain by simply writing something yourself. For generative images, it's different. If you're able to generate an entire image, particularly for abstract concepts, which are hard to illustrate at the best of times, I feel that is a very useful thing, but it is also a very disruptive thing. So that, whereas I would have gone to a stock image library in previous years, I am now going direct to DALL-E. And I think, given your perspective with these smaller operations, I think there must be a great temptation to use these tools as at least a supplement to their whatever image stuff they're using already. And I guess I want your perspective on what is the sense you're getting from you, both yourself and the people you're talking to, on like, is this a net good? Is it ethical? And what is the best practice both from a usage standpoint and an ethical standpoint on like that newsroom should be moving towards to ensure that we're using tools, but at the same time not overnight destroying entire ways people get their livelihoods, or maybe that's just inevitable. I don't know.
No, I hear that, and I use them all the time. I try not to use, or I only use the bad ones like Midjourney, which are clearly as educational or experimentation purpose. I soft boycott those ones because I don't. First of all, just to back up, it's insane to me that one of the first and most prominent ways the robots are taking the jobs they're taking are the fun ones, the creative ones. The capitalism was a mistake. I don't know how we ended up here. Why are the robots doing the good stuff and not doing the boring stuff? And of course, it's because that's the easily monetizable one. And
robotics is harder than it looks too.
Seriously, like it's so frustrating to see that. It's like I should be eating pizza and reading books and chilling, and instead, and our artists should be the ones working their asses off and creating beautiful art for everybody. And yet here we go, they're taking the artist jobs, which just pisses me off beyond degree. As somebody who went to art school and I consider myself creative. I love me some arts and crafts, whether it's digital or otherwise. That frustrates me to no end. And it's not the technology that is essentially doing this. Obviously, we always have to remember it's the bosses, it's the capitalists, it's the owners, it is the shareholders who are demanding this, soul-sucking process to remove humanity from the most human elements of us, the art. So putting that aside, fully on board with how annoying that is and how debilitating and depressing that is. Stock images is literally how I see them. When I do use them, I use either Photoshop's Firefly or whatever they're calling it now. I've messed around. I do like DALL-E to a certain extent. It's not super customizable, but no matter what I generate, I'm not just throwing that thing up online unless it's literally like a swirl of a certain color. And all of this like demand to have an image associated with every story really goes back to, honestly, social media companies and the way that feeds display articles. Like, you just write an article. Now you have to have a featured image with everything because 80% of people are only going to see that social card with the headline, the subheading, and the featured image. So not that I don't think that's a bad thing, because I think they're aesthetically pleasing. I like having image, headline, author, byline. Like, I think that's a cool little trio there, nice package. And for stories about, how many stories about the government have some, basic pictures of a white pillared government building? Do we need 16 photographers taking the same picture of the outside of a courthouse or a police station? And then everything. I'm not saying we need to get rid of it, but do you need to do that for those kind of stories? Probably not. But you do want or need, to have some image. And so if you are willing to go to a stock photo gallery, if you're going to use that, or Unsplash, as if there were no problems with Unsplash to begin with, we won't get into that. Use them like a stock photo, and that's fine. But even if you do that, throw it into Photoshop, throw it into Canva, mess around with it, make sure it fits. I see so many people assume or presume that you get an image from these things, and then that's the image, like as if you can't edit them. You're much less able to edit a stock photo in many cases because there's all kinds of licensing rights there. So if the images are licensed, if the models are trained ethically on licensed and purchased images, I have no problem with that from a theoretical standpoint. The issue I have is like there's no demand or right for these companies to exist or be profitable, especially if they've built their profit, their operation on stolen content and the theft of uncredited and unpaid artists or writers or whatever. So we have to separate the technology and the implications and the capitalists who are profiting off it, stealing from people. So if we take the technology, if we look at the technology, absolutely, this is incredible. Anybody who's ever used a Canva template as a starting point to make some promo graphic or flyer is essentially doing the same thing. You're taking a template that is a lot more customizable, right? And then you're making it your own, or you're just using the template and hoping that no real designer notices and says, oh, I know that's a Canva Pro template. That's one of my biggest fears, right? And anybody who's breaking into an industry and feels like an imposter, who wasn't classically or professionally trained or educated, knows that feeling of, I know I'm going to say that one wrong buzzword, or I'm going to, use a font that everybody thinks is super basic now, or I'm going to use the template that is going to be recognized, or the Adobe Premiere motion graphic template. I've been waiting for somebody to call me on that. Yes, I inserted my logo, but I know that sparkle stream, right? And so this gives you a little bit more flexibility, but you still have to like do something to it, unless the point is just to have the featured image for the social card. And if that's the point, then what are we arguing about? You shouldn't, and you're not going to win any awards for this. Nobody's going to pat you on the back for telling the computer to make you a cool picture. And if you do that, you're a loser anyway. So I think what's really the tension around this is that people are assuming that this is art, right? They're images, they're graphics, sure. And they should be seen as such. But I don't remember the last time anybody told me they were proud of me because I created a really sick, border at the bottom of my report or whatever. So see them for what they are. They're filler bullshit that you use because the computer tells you have to have an image for this. So you put something on there. When that's the case. When it's not the case, there are photojournalism, there are graphic designers and news designers. That is a valid skill, and you should do that. And if you use some of these tools, like the content aware fill in Photoshop, I remember the first time that came out, it was like 2004 or something, I think. I was editing Counter-Strike signatures and modding video games as like a 15-year-old. And the content aware fill came out. And I was like, oh my God. Or the patch tool came out. It wasn't a massive disruption, but now, it was an incredible advancement in the ability for me now to expand my skills without having to go through like 16 stages and layers just to get the color correction to be right in this blend, right? So as this is a little bit less incremental, or it feels like that, but ultimately the tool set is expanding, and something like Photoshop's generative fill, which is just essentially content-aware fill on steroids, it really has expanded my ability to patch over, essentially take a little bit of a shortcut to making things mesh or blend a little better. And in that sense, I think it's great. It's fun. But don't steal from people to build these tools. Don't rip them off. Don't try to act like this is some kind of artistic feat on your part, or even really art at all, depending on how you use it. And you'll be fine. And I don't think most people who use the tools, unless you are, again, one of those crypto bro converts, or you're one of the 1,000-yard stare entrepreneurs, those are the people who are acting like this is some kind. Now they're artists doing this. Whereas the regular user or the average user is just like, oh my God, this is saving me time. Now I'm working on this graphic that I hate for this client who sucks. Like, I can get this done quicker, and I can get back to making my actual art that I feel proud of. So that was long-winded, but that's where I'm at.
No, it all makes sense. And I think in particular, the part about the social card really resonates, because you're right. Not back in the day, not every article needed an image. You could just put out your 200 words on the earnings report of, Nuco or whatever, and move on. And certain technology required certain things. But that said, it's a good transition to projecting forward, right? Because a lot of concerns and weirdness with respect to AI content today has to do, I believe, with stuffing this technology into sort of a Web 2.0 world, right?
Oh my God, yeah.
Although I'm not endorsing a Web 3 view of things, but I'm sort of projecting forward to there's a new ecosystem that AI is going to facilitate because of what it does, right? So it's kind of like, if content gets super cheap to make and the internet's flooded with AI generated content, which is already happening and probably inevitable. What that's going to lead to is a new way to find content that is beyond what our current sort of SEO social world is used to, right? And we're starting to see this in some form with, in media. There, it's strategies are now pointing towards being niche and not factoring in search and social as much because that traffic's dying off. That trend might continue. Again, I'm just citing that as an example of we're already seeing the trend lines and a new era sort of start to not necessarily emerge yet, but the old ones collapsing. And so um, this is leading to the question, which is that project out a few years, think about how these AI tools are sort of affecting our environment, and what does it look
Yeah.
like being a reporter or editor, 5 years from now, when AI is, to your point, was something you said early on, fading into the background. Like, what do you think are some basic ways the profession is just going to be different in 5 years?
Well, I think for one, I think it's very. People tend to forget how quickly people get annoyed. The culture gets annoyed by something. It was very quickly that you can spot the AI image aesthetic, for instance.
Right, sure.
Even if you can't count the fingers and the fingers don't look weird, or the mouth or whatever, or like all that stuff aside, it becomes very the saturation happens really quickly. And then what happens is that it's not cool. People don't like it. And I talk about culture and cool a lot because I don't think people really appreciate just how much industry and business is influenced by what people hate and people think is cool. Look at the adoption of stories, for instance, across every social media app. Look at the duplication of everything TikTok does on all the other video serving apps. What people like, the businesses try to replicate and they try to profit off of. And when people get annoyed by something or it becomes uncool, it's very quickly abandoned by the taste makers. And when the taste makers abandon it or shun it or make fun of it, culture is very quick to adapt to that, and it expands and finds new ways. And I think in the same way, we're seeing that with the AI image generation. We're seeing that with the you can, if you read enough AI drivel, you can start to spot it in the wild. No AI detector tool in the world actually works. I mean, the studies show that they're just not good, and you shouldn't rely on that. But give me a couple minutes. And again, also the research shows that most people can't spot AI writing as well. But in your heart of hearts, when you see it, you feel like you see it, you know it, and you remember that. And what's funny about that is the cycle as it happens. What was annoying or not cool in earlier years circles around and eventually becomes nostalgia, and then becomes retro and becomes cool again in an ironic way. And so I think we need to stop worrying so much about that cycle or that shift, because it is recurring in a lot of ways at a meta level. Whether or not the jobs will respond to that, whether or not the industries will move that way, I can guarantee they're going to move way slower than they need to in the areas where it matters, and way quicker than they should in the areas where it matters, in other areas where it matters. Whether it's trying to be, a data-driven content, or it's the pivot to video that inevitably falls out from under us, and now all of a sudden, we actually don't need video. I think the companies are going to continue to chase that dragon, no matter where it leads them. They will obviously always be one step behind it, if not more. But ultimately, I think the core thing about this industry, what these developments will ultimately lead to, is a refocusing and a revaluation of genuine human connection, genuine relationships. Authenticity has already been the buzzword for like 6 or 7 years, but truly, the mark of a trusted publication or a trusted source will be one that is demonstrated, not that they've never touched AI tools, but it demonstrated an authentic and genuine relationship and a passion for what they do. People want good shit. They don't want garbage, right? As Doctorow, or I think it's Doctorow who says it. They don't want your cheap shit. They want the good shit, and they're willing to pay for it, and they're willing to find it. And if you make good shit, people will appreciate that. And if you do it consistently, you can establish a reputation for good shit, and the cheap shit will fall to the sides. I hope I'm allowed to say bad words on this podcast, because I kind of just jumped in there with it. I don't know if you have to pull out the bleep, but that is really, I think that's really at the core of what it is. I mean, it's like there's a sea of cheap garbage out there. The way to differentiate yourself is to not make garbage. That's it. And if you use certain tools to make good stuff, then people will be forgiving. But if you're just looking to make cheap shit and hope people will get fooled enough times, or enough people get fooled to give you a boost in your bottom line, then cool, keep doing that. See how that works out for you. How did that work out for all these other publications that are in the dirt now because they chased the dragon too far or whatever and didn't give a shit about the people that they're actually meant to serve and their employees?
I think that's ultimately an optimistic point you're making.
I am.
Good stuff rising to the top.
I'm so sorry if I'm not allowed to curse.
It's all good.
Okay.
No, I think it works. So I would love to leave it there, but I got to ask you my final question, which is, what is the one thing anyone and everyone in the media business should know about generative AI?
One thing they should know. I mean, that's a tough one. It's annoying. It's really annoying at this point. It's everywhere. And anytime something is everywhere so fast, it's always important to take a step back and go like, how much of this is hype? How much of this is actually useful? How much of this has any foresight beyond like the next 3 months? And is this really, sometimes it can feel like we're in a totally new reality now. And at that point, it's very helpful to just kind of log off, talk to your offline friends. Most of my students, even, which is wild to me, had never tried ChatGPT, had never tried these bots, or they're very good liars. And I've already established, I think, over a couple of weeks that they're not very good liars. So I don't think it's as crazy and as ubiquitous quite yet as it feels on Twitter and wherever else. That's not to say that won't eventually hit the quote unquote mainstream. But I think it's important to take a step back and log off every once in a while and just be like, is this necessary? Is this something that we before we had this, we were in shambles? Probably not, maybe in some cases. And is this the answer? If it's just one thing, it usually is not the answer. The answer is almost always authenticity and human experience, human connection. Because that is really what journalism is about. It's a place-making, it's an identity-making thing. It allows you to connect to other people, to communities, to institutions, to your own life and your own neighborhood. And anything outside of that is bullshit.
Perfect word to end on. Joe, this has been great. Thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank you for having me.
All right, you have been listening to the Media Copilot. Please visit us at mediacopilot.ai to subscribe to our newsletter and check out our classes that we offer to journalists, marketers, and content creators. You can also follow us on Twitter at @TheMediaCopilot. Be seeing you in the future.